Boker Tov. It's very, very nice to see you all. (2023), I think we could all agree on I'm pretty sure we could all agree on the following statement, that 2023 was the worst year in the history of Medinat Israel. Can we agree on that? So it starts with 9 months of what got close to what Israelis called Milchemet Achim Kara, a cold civil war. That was the first 9 months between January 2023 and October 2023. And then after 9 months of cold civil war that made Israel weaker and weaker, October 7th happened. There is a connection between these two pieces. Our enemies did notice that we're becoming weaker and that we're making ourselves weaker. October 7th, and then we entered this horrible war, and now we are in a very complicated situation. Now, if anyone that visited Israel during the 9 months of 2023, during the cold civil war, or not even visited Israel and walked in the streets, just entered social media, so he or she would notice that, well, a few things. One, this is a civil war between the Israeli Jews because the Arabs, for their own reasons, some of them good, decided, we're staying out of this one. This is for them. This is for the Israeli Jews, the massive majority, roughly 80%, 75-80%, to work out between them. The Arabs decided not to be a part of that internal battle we were having here. The second thing here she would notice is that now among those 75-80% of Israelis that are fighting with each other, well, they're divided into two camps. And the way they're divided into two camps is the following. Israel is a Jewish democracy. That's the formula of Israel. Well, that hybrid formula, Jewish democracy, was just divided into its parts. And we have Jewish Israel, and we have democratic Israel, and it's Jewish Israel against democratic Israel, and democratic Israel against Jewish Israel. And once you've established intuitively, immediately, that Israel is divided into two, Jewish Israel versus democratic Israel, and Jewish Israel is populated with people that are sure that they are the authentic representatives of Judaism, and democratic Israel is populated by people that think that the Jewish Israel is not democratic and only they have true democratic sensitivities. Once you've established that Israel is divided into two, then it's very easy to project onto this dichotomy everything else. Jewish Israel is nationalistic Israel. Democratic Israel is liberal Israel. Jewish Israel is Israel shel Yerushalayim. Democratic Israel is Israel shel Tel Aviv. And here we have it. Jewish Israel is tied to the past. Democratic Israel, Israel of Tel Aviv, is facing the future. It's so easy to create this dichotomy, dividing Israel neatly into two camps, clashing with each other. It's very easy to do that. But when we look into this dichotomy, which I will argue later on that this is a false dichotomy, that this is an optical illusion to divide Israel into two camps. I think Israel should be divided into three. I'll share this idea I'll probably reach it like in a half an hour or so. But while we believe this optical illusion that we're divided into two, liberals versus nationalistic Jews, Democrats, Yerushalayim, Israel HaRishona, and also Israel HaRishona, Israel HaShniya is projected into this. Israel HaRishona meaning Ashkenazi Israel, Israel HaShniya meaning Mizrahi Israel. This is one thing that American Jews have a hard time understanding about Israelis. In America, I think the relationship between Ashkenazim and Mizrahim is 90-10, right? In Israel, it's 50-50. So it's very easy for that to fit into the dichotomy of Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, liberal, national, the whole. But before I go there, I want to notice that this is not an Israeli phenomenon. Divide a society into two and creating a narrative that two parts of society have nothing really in common. And because they don't have shared ideas and shared values, they don't really have a shared future. And since they have nothing in common, their only real interaction between them is not through compromise, but through they're doomed to clash with each other. That understanding of society that Israelis started buying in 2023. By the way, in 2023, the idea that became exponentially most popular was the idea that Israel needs to be literally divided into two, Israel v'Yehuda. Different ideas of how to do this, cantons or separate states, because if we don't share anything with each other, maybe we have a shared past, but we definitely don't have a shared future. But this idea that seemed to Israelis so Israeli, it's our problem, well, if you look at the world, that's not an Israeli problem. The idea that society is divided into two and one side is good and the other side is evil and we have to defeat the evil, that binary narrative started to become very popular in the West in the past decade. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, I think, I mentioned, some of you, I like mentioning this quote of Sachs. In his last book, which I think is his most important book, Morality, he has this line, which I want to take very seriously. And if some of you heard me say this line, so forgive me. Political polarization is the societal equivalent of climate change. Political polarization is the societal equivalent of climate change. Now, this is a very interesting analogy, trying to say that humanity is facing not one, but two threats. One threat is climate change, global warming, which is threatening the future of our ability to have a modern civilization on planet Earth. That's one threat. The second threat is political polarization, which is a societal equivalent of climate change. And the interesting thing about this analogy is that both phenomenons are unintended consequences of a technological revolution. Where global warming is the unintended consequence of which revolution? The Industrial Revolution. And it's an unintended, no one thought 250 years ago in London that this will lead to global warming and to climate change. And at the same time, if global warming is one of the unintended consequences of the Industrial Revolution, political polarization is one of the unintended consequences of which revolution? The digital revolution. And as Jonathan Haidt points out, in the 1990s, if you go to Silicon Valley, they didn't know this was going to happen. They were filled with what he calls techno-optimism. That this revolution will make the world more friendly for democracy. And by the way, that does make sense. That makes sense. Did too many people hear me talk about this already? Yeah? Okay. I'm becoming 50 in November, and I already forgot when I say what. It's all one big. It's all one big. Well, thank you. It's like. So back in the 90s, as Haidt describes, there was a sense that if knowledge is power, So democratization of knowledge, democratization of information will lead to democratization of power. That makes sense. The digital revolution is supposed to make a world that's friendly for democracy. And then like 20 years later, you realize the law of unintended consequences. That it's true that we have democratization of information, but that comes with a package of democratization of disinformation. And if in the past, in America, 4 or 5% of people always believed in conspiracy theories, post-digital revolution, how many percentage of Americans believe in conspiracy theories? Well, all the rest of them, more or less. Where every political group has a different conspiracy theory, but the power structures of society that we have, and as a result, when conspiracy theories go mainstream, we don't share a shared reality anymore. And can you have a shared society where you don't have a shared reality? That's a very big question. So I'm saying is, now it's very possible that in order to ask what happened to Israel, it's the wrong question. Because if you see high levels of polarization in Brazil, in Argentina, in Poland, in France, in the United States, if you see that polarization is on the rise all over the world, so you should, instead of asking, what's wrong with Israel, that would be like asking, what happened to the summer of Tel Aviv? Why is it that things are so burning up? Why are summers longer in Tel Aviv? What's the problem of Tel Aviv? That would be the wrong question. It's not that Tel Aviv has a problem with its summer. There's global warming. Instead of asking what went wrong in Tel Aviv, you have to ask what's going on to planet Earth. And if polarization is a Western phenomenon, instead of not only asking what went wrong in Israel, we need to be asked what's wrong, what's going wrong in the world or in Western civilization. Now, as Ezra Klein, in his great book, Why We're Polarized, points out, there's different ways to think about polarization, and one of them is not only ideological, meaning the right becoming more right, the left becoming more left, and therefore the gap between them growing. There's also an emotional process, not only an ideological process, where it's not that the ideological gaps between the sides are growing, the emotional gap is growing. And one way to think about this, the growing of the emotional gap, is that polarization, or what he calls emotional polarization or affective polarization, is the rise of a very specific brand of hate. Like there's different brands of hate. If you hate someone because of the color of their skin, that has a name. What's that? That's racism. If you hate someone because of their sexual preference or tendency, that has a name also. What's that? That's homophobia. If you hate someone because they're a leftist, or because they support Bibi Netanyahu, that also has a name. That very specific brand of hate is polarization. Or better put, in a polarized world, that brand of hate grows. It's on steroids. And Klein has a lot of statistics about now how his statistics are about the United States of America. How in the past, Republicans thought Democrats were good people with wrong views, and Democrats thought Republicans were good people with wrong views. Today, when they're asked, what are they? What do Republicans think about Democrats? They're not good people with wrong views. What are they? They're bad people, and those views are just evidence that they are bad, because only a corrupt personality would have those views. That's a shift. Now, there's this new book just came out. I want to say Dvarim B'Shem Omram, but I'm 50, so I can't. These are my called The Age of Grievance. The Age of Grievances by Bruni. Bruni. He's famous? Okay. Okay, thank you. Okay. So Somebody recommended this book, but so he's a thing. Okay. Where Americans, I'm speaking to you as if I'm speaking to Israelis about Americans. Amerikaim. So if it's okay if I continue. Yeah. Are asked, who is the greatest threat to the future of our country? China, Iran, Russia, or the Republicans? And Republicans are asked to say, China or the Democratic Party. And the most common answer lately is the greatest threat to America are Republicans. Not China, not Iran, not Russia, and if you're Republicans, obviously it's the Democrats. That's polarization. Now, polarization works the following way. When you believe that the other side is a real threat to the future of your country, then you start thinking very differently about politics. Because now we're in a new game, and here's the game. It used to be that the other side is making us weak because it doesn't know how to solve the problem. The problem meaning global warming, meaning immigration, meaning issues like guns. The other side doesn't understand how to solve the problem. I disagree with the other side on how to solve the problem, and the other side doesn't get it because it's wrong. It doesn't know, and therefore, the stubborn other side is blocking our ability to solve the problem. That's how we used to think in a world that wasn't polarized. The other side doesn't know how to solve the problem. In a polarized world, the problem with the other side is not that it doesn't know how to solve the problem, is that the other side is the problem. That shift makes all the difference. Because when I have a disagreement with the other side about how to solve the problem, well, we could talk about it, and in the end, reach the greatest achievement of democracy, which is compromise. But when the other side, it's not that it doesn't know how to solve the problem, but its very existence is the problem, so I can't compromise with the other side because that's legitimizing the other side. I can't compromise with the other side, so I'm only left with one option, which is to defeat the other side. And here's the problem. And I'm doing that because I'm a patriot, because I want to save the country. I want to save the country from the greatest threat on the future of this country. The greatest threat is the other side. The problem is that when I understand that in order to save the country, I have to defeat the other side and make it weaker and less dominant so I won't poison our society with its ideas, whatever it is, whatever my narrative is about the other side. The problem is that who has the same thought exactly? The other side. So here's the dynamic. Both sides want to save the country by defeating the other side. And as a result, this happens simultaneously. The attempt to save the country, what does it do? It weakens it and leads to its own deterioration. That's the problem that's one of the paradoxes of polarization. Now, I want to bring you into an awareness that Israelis are starting to have post-October 7th. If just my analysis at why polarization makes society so weak, because when Ezra Klein has this great, I'm just interested if this is interesting only for Israelis or also for Americans. In Roosevelt, when FDR was promoting his very serious reforms, the New Deal, and had to pass legislation in Congress, roughly, this is Ezra Klein, 40% of Republicans, he was a Democratic president, voted with him. And also when Johnson promoted his pretty radical reforms, high percentage of Republicans voted with him. When Obama tried to pass a reform which is much less radical, the Obamacare, what percentage of Republicans voted with Obama? In percent, 0. So what happens for radical reforms? 40% vote with FDR. And for a moderate reform, 0% vote with Obama. What happened? Now, it's not only the Republicans, also the Democrats changed. What happened? Well, here's what happened. The question changed. Instead of asking what, you're asking who. Instead of asking what is the idea, let's see if it's a good idea, you're asking who is offering it. And if it's a Democrat, I'm against it. If it's a Republican, I'm against it. If it's a Bibi supporter, I'm definitely against it. Or if it's a Smolani, I'm definitely against it. And the question changing is a direct, this question from what to who. Does this sound well in English? Mima le mi? Yeah. So from what to who is the result of understanding. And the other side is not an obstacle because it doesn't understand how to solve the problem. The other side is the problem, which means a polarized society is a society that's paralyzed. It can't reach compromise. They can't work together. It's paralyzed. And the only thing they could do with each other is defeat each other. And as a result, polarization weakens society. And one of the paradoxes is that the world is changing. In order to adjust to a changing world, we have to change our societies. To change our societies, we have to reach compromise. And dafka now, when we need to change our societies, we need compromise. The climate is an anti-compromise climate. This is a universal problem. Israel is a part of the world, so Israel has this problem. But Israelis are coming to an interesting understanding post-October 7th. Is that Israel is different than other countries in the world in the following sense. As an Israeli commander put it a few months ago, the two words, a weak Israel, is an oxymoron. A weak Israel is an oxymoron. Why is it an oxymoron? It's like the sound of silence, right? It's a contradiction. Why is a weak Israel an oxymoron? Because if it's weak, there is no Israel. And if there is Israel, it's probably not weak. But a weak Israel does not fit together. And that sucks. Because every person, every individual, we have a weak day every now and then. Maybe even a weak month or a week. We're not at our best all the time. And in healthy communities, we tolerate the fact that every now and then someone has his turn or her turn not to have a good day, not to be at their best. But do societies have that privilege also? Yes, if you're America, to have a weak day, to have a weak decade. Yes, but if you're Israel and you have a weak day, what happens to you? October 7th. So Israel doesn't have the privilege that individuals have or that strong countries have. We don't have the privilege to be weak. That's assumption number one. Assumption number two, when we are highly polarized, we become weak. And the conclusion of these two assumptions is that Israel does not have the privilege to become too polarized. Which means if you do... But the problem is that Israel is a part of the West. Israel is suffering from the unintended consequences of the digital revolution. And Israel that doesn't have the privilege to be polarized became very polarized in 2023 and therefore very weak in 2023. And now we see where we are. So I want to offer I want to go into this dichotomy, what I think is a false dichotomy of two Israels, the story of two Israels, of Tel Aviv Israel versus Jerusalem Israel. But before I do that, does anybody have any comments or questions about, just establishing the idea that polarization makes a society weak? Or is it like, yes?
Let slavery go on because too much polarization to fight the Civil War. Should we not have sent our troops to fight the Nazis? Because it's too much polarization. We shouldn't let that happen. Are there times where we have to say, and then how do we decide? How do we determine when we actually have reached that boundary of evil?
I have no idea what the answer to your question is. Because it's such a loaded question about relativism, about their role, about where the border. Yeah, so I'm just going to skip over your important question. What? Yeah, I just want to. No. I just want to hear some voices, just so I could. It's for me. It's not for you. It's yes.
When you say instead of asking what the policy proposal is, people ask who is proposing it.
Yeah.
Are you suggesting that if Bibi Netanyahu was not the head of the government with regard to judicial reform, that people would have supported it?
Yes. Definitely. In Israel, here's an interesting fact about Israel. 2023, we were having this massive internal argument about judicial reform. And you would have thought that Israel is divided into two camps. The people who support the government's reform, judicial reform, and the people who are against the revolution. There's different language to describe the same phenomenon. And we have one camp versus the other camp, and the binary Israel is in action. But when you look at the polls show something different. While it seemed like Israel is divided into two, Israel was actually divided into three. And here's how it sounded like 17% of Israelis were for the government's judicial reform, a radical transformation of the legal system in Israel. There was about, in the left, there was about 20% of Israelis that were against any change, against changing the status quo. Which, by the way, is very interesting. The far right wants radical change. The far left wants to conserve the status quo. Just to remind you, in the French Revolution, people sitting to the right were for the status quo. People sitting to the left were for change. And that's how those metaphors were created. Left is for change. Right is for status quo. In 2023 in Israel, the left was for conserving the status quo. The left was conservative. The right was radical. What happens when right thinks like left and left thinks like right? You know what happens? That's welcome to Israel. That's what happens. But 57% of Israelis agreed between themselves that we need a reform, we need change, not that change. More subtle, more balanced, and especially, most importantly, with broad agreement. But how is it that while 57% of Israelis were for compromise and for a reform as opposed to the conservatives on the left, but a moderate agreed upon reform as opposed to the radicals of the right, how is it that that's the majority of Israelis, but we never heard about them? We did not hear the music of compromise. And that's because we are victims of this optical illusion, that Israel is divided into two, neatly into two. By the way, this is something. This this probably has evolutionary origins, like in natural selection, where our tendency to be tempted to divide reality very, very quickly into two, and then to create an ethical judgment. This is good, this is evil. I mean, think about someone, not Homo sapiens, like maybe Homo habilis, one of the versions that we used to be 2 million years ago in the savannah of Africa, walking, hearing noises in a bush. And let's say it had a brain that was like very ambivalent. It was like, there's 84 options what that could be. Some are good, some are bad. I wonder which one from the 84 options of what that noise could be. What happened to those very nuanced, ambivalent genes? What happened to them? I'll tell you what didn't happen with them. They didn't make it to this room. They didn't survive natural selection. They didn't make it. But what happens if you have like genes that were like, even though there's 1,000 options, immediately There's two options. Either it's a rabbit, which is good because it's calories for me, or it's a lion, and that's bad because I'm calories for him. Those are only the two options. Now that understanding of reality is not a true understanding of reality, but natural selection does not reward truth. What does it reward? Survival. And that image, carrying that, increased that. Those are the genes that made it here, that divide everything very quickly into two and making a moral judgment. This is good, this is evil. And as Jonathan Haidt put it, what do algorithms do? When they see a post, a video that has nuance, that has shades of gray, it's not going to prioritize it. Because that's not a post or a video that's going to grab people's attention, and it won't be in service of the attention economy. Yeah, is this rhetoric, attention economy, did it make it around? But if I write a post that makes very, very clear who's good, who's bad, best if you're a victim, and if you could blame some evil force. The right has the idea that the elites are evil. The left has the idea that there's a hegemony that's evil. Whatever, there is when I write that way a post, the algorithm is going to capture it, prioritize it, and spread it. So where are we? Natural selection created a temptation to think in binary terms. Algorithms, what do they do to that temptation? They tap into it and amplify it. To quote Haidt, you know what the world we're in is what happens when biology is weaponized with technology. When biology, meaning the way we evolved to very quickly to be seduced to divide things into two, I think the role of culture is to soften that tendency. The role of education is to help us overcome that tendency. But what technology does, it amplifies that tendency. So the world we live in is what happens when biology is weaponized with technology. So you live in a world where it's very, very quickly, we divide the world. Very quickly. Israel is two. Yerushalayim, Tel Aviv. Israel הראשונה, ישראל השנייה. ישראל היהודית, ישראל הדמוקרטית. That comes so easy to us to divide us into two. And then to create the narrative that the other side is a threat to society. So to save society, you have to defeat the other side. The problem is the other side is thinking the exact same thoughts. And while we're both trying to save society, we're weakening society. And in Israel, to be weak is not an option. So I want to go with so I want to go deeper into this optical illusion called it, binary Israel. A book that I wrote that came out in Hebrew, it will probably come out in English, but it's in Hebrew, called Hayom Hashmini, and I'm sorry I'm going to be quoting from my book now. I always thought that lectures that quote their own books are. Here I am. So in a very important book. It's called The Eighth Day, Hayom Hashmini. It's based on a few observations of very thoughtful Israelis and some intuitions that I have, but also try to be based on a massive poll. You say poll, Seker Dat Kahal? A poll done about Israelis, trying to understand Israelis not through the way they identify themselves, so you're right-winger or left-winger, but to measure Israelis, the Israelis that participated in the Cold Civil War of 2023, which means the Jewish part of Israel, try to see, for them to help them measure themselves in light of not one, but two different values. One value is nationalism, and the second value is liberalism. Now, I know the word nationalism sounds different in English than it does in Hebrew. It sounds different. Because in Hebrew, we can make a distinction between le'umiyut and le'omanut. And I don't think you have that same distinction in English. There's maybe patriotism and nationalism. Le'omanut means nationalism that you experience uniqueness. and belonging to your nation by negation and patronizing other nations. That's le'omanut. Le'umiyut is just healthy love of your people. You don't have that. So just when I say nationalism, I mean le'umiyut, not maybe, is that how you, maybe you use patriotism is the word you would use? What? So when I say nationalism, I mean it in a softer way, the connotation. I mean it in Hebrew, not in English. So, and when I say liberalism, I mean liberalism in the sense of John Locke, John Stuart Mill. Liberalism, individuals have rights. They were given to every individual either by nature or by God, depends if you're British or French, but in the sense the rights were not given to you by the government. And therefore, the government didn't give us our rights, therefore the government can take them away. That sense of liberalism. So you measure Israelis, how nationalistic are you? How proud are you of your heritage? What's the sense of belonging you have to Israel? Are you willing to serve your country? Are you willing to die for your country? How nationalistic are you? From, let's say, 1 to 100. And how liberal are you? How much are human rights important to you? Human autonomy, how sacred is government out of my life? I need independent institutions to protect my autonomy from the naked power of government. How non-judgmental am I towards ways of life that are different than my own? How liberal are you? And when we use these two values to try to measure Israelis, here's what you find. In the far right in Israel, there's a group it's not a large group, but it's not a small group. It's not a very small group of Israelis that score very high on nationalism and very low on liberalism. I call that group a homogeneous group in the sense that it has one value that's dominant, nationalism. And it's not balanced or softened by alternative values. One value, that's why it's homogeneous. In the far left, what we call the post-Zionist left in Israel, there's a group that's not large, it's actually small. It's not symmetric, it's not the same size of the group in the far right. It's smaller, it's significantly smaller. There they score, how do they score, you could guess? High on liberalism, low on nationalism, and the interesting, also homogeneous, one value, one dominant value. And the interesting thing is that both groups have a narrative. And the narrative is narrative of purity. In the sense, in the right, they believe that liberalism will contaminate nationalism, weaken nationalism. It's an abstract, universal idea, not Jewish, not authentic. If we're too liberal, our nationalism will weaken. We have to protect nationalism from liberalism. And in the far left, we have the same narrative in the sense that nationalism will threaten liberalism. Nationalism is always fascism, it's always racism, it's always the worst form of nationalism, and it will destroy liberalism. And to protect liberalism, we have to shut down nationalism. So liberalism, for liberalism to be actualized, it has to be pure and not contaminated by an alternative value. So these are two homogeneous groups. One value. Only liberalism in the far left, only nationalism in the far right. But most Israelis, the largest group of Israel, are the Israelis that score very high on nationalism. They die for this country. And very high on liberalism. We have rights, we have autonomy, government stay out of my life, and I'm not judgmental about ways of life that are different than my own. Which means while we have homogeneous groups in the right and the left, majority of Israelis are hybrid, nationalist liberals. You're right. The origins of that is Jabotinsky, Begin, Nachon. It's nationalist liberals. Now, this idea of hybrid Israelis, which is the largest group of Israel, has a problem. Because we have an optical illusion. Israel is divided into two. While an X-ray image of Israel would show we're divided into three. only nationalists, only liberal, and national liberals, and largest group in Israel. Now this hybrid group is a group with no group awareness. It's a group that doesn't know it's a group. Now, why is a group doesn't know in the group? Because in the mental map we have of Israel, there's two Israels, Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. So all the hybrid Israelis are like, okay, where do I fit? To national Israel or to liberal Israel? But not understanding they're a group of their own. Now, I want to think about this hybrid nationalism, liberalism. Because the tragedy of this group, besides not having group awareness, is the following. What happens when you have two values, nationalism and liberalism? So that group, all of the Israelis have the same values. I'm thinking in Hebrew, I hope this works in English. They have the same values, but they don't have the same quantities. You understand what I'm saying? Like some of these hybrid Israelis that are national and liberal are a little bit more national than liberal. And that's okay. Some are a little bit more liberal than national. Sababa. They have the same values, but they don't have the same quantities. Is that English? Proportions. Proportions would be the better. I just want to. What? אני אומר, אותם ערכים, לא אותם מינונים. אותם ערכים, לא אותם המינונים. Proportions. Okay, the same values, not the same proportions. And by the way, I don't buy that either. I'll tell you in a minute why. But here's our tragedy. Israelis have the same values, not the same proportions. But then what happens when the hybrid Israelis are a little bit more national than liberal, become allies of the Israelis that are only national and not liberal? Or like what happened in the past, Israelis are a little bit more liberal than national, become allies of the Israelis, folks that are only liberal and not national. What happens then? Then Israel, that is divided into three, finds itself where it's divided politically into two. That is how one of the ways that the optical illusion is created. And by the way, it's connected to each other because there's no group awareness. There isn't a sense of hybrid Israelis we're loyal to each other because we're not a group. So Israelis are a little bit more national than liberal, become allies of the Israelis that are only national and not liberal, and the result is this government. Where hybrid Israelis couldn't stick with each other. And they're divided among each other. Because the map, a mental map we have is that we're divided into two. We have to fit ourselves in the Democratic camp or the Jewish camp. And by the way, even what I said, that we have the same values, not the same proportions, I just say that because it makes people, Israelis, come, oh, okay, the difference between me and him, I'm a little more national, he's more liberal, but we have the same values. But I don't really believe that, by the way. Because it's a Western way to think that I could somehow quantify my values. There's like ratio of 5 to 4, 5 to 4. I'm 5 liberalism, 4 nationalism, and that's who I am, and you're the other way around. But that's assuming a Greek assumption that our internal world reaches a moment of equilibrium and it becomes static. That balance is, it's like, okay, you'll have to help me here because I'm thinking in Hebrew, the kapot maznaim. Scales. Yeah. Very sophisticated word. So when the scales are balanced, what does that mean? That there's the same weight on every one of the scales, right? So how do you balance nationalism with liberalism? We need 50 kilo of liberalism on one scale, 50 kilo of nationalism on the other scale, and then it's balanced and it's static. And that goes back to Aristotle, that anything that's perfect is static. It just stays that way. The ancient Chinese philosophers, thinkers, like the I Ching or Tao Te Ching, they believed in balance, but a different understanding of balance. Balance is not static, it's dynamic. The ancient symbol of yin and yang is that the balance between yin and yang is not that we have the same proportions of yin and yang all the time. And I know, it's like this. There's a time where the yang is more dominant and a time where the yin is more dominant. Yang is more dominant and then yin is more dominant. And those movements from yang to yin and from yin to yang, those movements, those changes do not violate the balance. Those movements are the balance. So I'm a believer that the hybrid Israelis have to think about themselves not using the metaphor of the scale, but which is a static. But yeah, by the way, this year in 2024, are Israelis more liberal or more national? More national. And say, oh my God, we're losing our balance. Well, no, we're after October 7th. That's natural. Next year we'll probably be more liberal. That's how. That will be a Eastern way of understanding a dynamic balance, not a static balance. But let's say, but we still need, okay, we have the same values, not necessarily same proportions. I would like now to dig deeper into the, let's call it the theology of hybrid Israeliness. It shouldn't come as a surprise that the large group of Israelis are hybrid, because the formula of Medinat Israel is a hybrid formula. What is the formula of Medinat Israel as, I think this is the best interpretation of Megillat HaAtzmaut, of our Declaration of Independence. What is the formula, what is the hybrid formula of Israel? Medina, Yehudit, v'demokratit. A Jewish democratic state. Now what I'd like to, so what are hybrid Israelis? They're the Israelis that internalized the hybrid formula of their country. It's not an external formula. It was internalized. It's not something that they believe in. It becomes who they are. So what I would like to do now, entering the second part of this lecture, is to try to understand this formula of Jewish democracy, which will help us understand the hybrid nature of the largest group in Israel that doesn't know that that we can't see it when the mental map we use to understand Israel is divided into two. So when we say Israel Yehudit v'demokratit, when we say the word Yehudit, what do we mean? What do we mean when we say Yehudit? Now it's a problem because anyone that studies Judaism knows that it's hard to define Judaism. And that there is many possible understandings and meanings to the term Judaism. So which one of them is the one that we choose? Which one of them is the one that we mean when we say Yehudit v'demokratit? Which one of them is the Yehudit? Is the Jewish part? Now, I think according to the Israeli tradition, as started by Megillat HaAtzmaut, we don't mean Judaism as a religion. Israel is not the Vatican of Judaism. It's not a state of a religion. What is Israel? It's Medinat HaLeom Shel Ha'am HaYehudi. Medinat HaLeom, the nation state of the Jewish people. This is how, from the very beginning, from the Balfour Declaration, spoke about, by the way, I think I love the metaphor of a home. Yeah, where it spoke, the Balfour Declaration spoke about or ever since 1897, from the first Zionist Congress, Bayit Le'umi, a national home for the Jewish people. That's why Israelis feel comfortable speaking about the Bayit HaShlishi. When Israelis say Bayit Shlishi, they don't mean Beit HaMikdash HaShlishi. What do they mean? Bayit in the sense of the home of our nation. HaBayit HaShlishi. So when we say Judaism, we mean in the sense that there is a collective that you belong to, not a religion that you believe in. It's about belonging, not about believing. It's a collective that you belong to. And I want to think about this a minute because it's not the Yehudit, and the Yehudit Demokratit is not a law that you obey. It's not a faith that you believe in. It's a story that you belong to. Let me try to unpackage this a bit. In the Mishnah in Bikurim, in Masechet Bikurim, when we're supposed to perform the ritual of bringing the Bikurim, how do you say the Bikurim? The first fruits to Beit HaMikdash. And when are we supposed to bring them to Beit HaMikdash? Let's say in Shavuot. That's a good reading. Not of the Tanakh, of Chazal. So you bring the first fruits, and there's a text you're supposed to say called Mikra Bikurim. And what does it say in Mikra Bikurim? The text you say, the words you say when you offer your first fruits to the priest. What do you say? Arami Oved Avi. That one of my ancestors was an Arami. And then it says, and part of the text says, Vebanu el haaretz, we came to the land that you promised to our fathers. Nishmat ala avotenu. So here's a question of the Mishnah. Does a convert say this text? What's the question here? Can a convert just join the club, just join the collective? His ancestors come from other places. Can a convert say, Arami Oved Avi? Can a convert say that? Because it's not his, And then the Mishnah, what does the Mishnah say, by the way? That he can't. The Mishnah is against it. The Talmud is, in the end, Maimonides has a psika that a convert always says Avi. It's Eloheinu. And Rambam was very passionate and clear about this. That a convert that joins the club retroactively, the ancestors of the Am are his ancestors. Now, this is very interesting because it's a great window into what collectivism is and what belonging is. There's something magical about belonging. Or every time there's a transformation, there's a giyur. When people change a collective, that's it. There is a moment that's created, that's a window to look into and to understand the depth of collectivism. My mom was a convert. She converted to Judaism from Catholicism. She was born and raised in Oklahoma City. Is anybody here from Oklahoma? Not one? Has anybody here ever been to Oklahoma? Okay. But Oklahoma City, not Tulsa. There's some Jews in Tulsa. I'm from Oklahoma City. That's okay. And she comes from a very Catholic family. My mom's oldest brother, he was Uncle Bill. My mom is one out of 7. Did I say that? So my mom's oldest brother, Uncle Bill, was a priest. My mom's uncle, we called him Grunkle Jack. He was high-ranked in the Vatican. He was John Paul II's personal advisor. Yeah. This is my yichus. In Israel, everybody's like, oh, I'm the descendant of the Gaon Mivilna. I'm from the Baal Shem Tov. Well, I'm I don't know, from the Pope or whatever. So I have a cousin which is a priest. I have another cousin which is a nun. I was once asked, there was a mifgash of Israelis with ultra-Orthodox, and beforehand we were asked, does anybody have Charedim in their family? And I said, yeah. Yeah, I have, that's the frum side of my family. So, no, serious. Anyway, I'm sharing all this because as a child, I was very aware of my mom's Catholic background. I was very aware of it because I was raised here, born here in Jerusalem, raised here in Jerusalem, very frum, Orthodox, Israeli, Zion education. And I have my grandmother used to come because my granddad passed away when he was very young. She used to stay over and she used to come with her big cross. And I just thought that this, when you're a kid, everything is normal, right? So every frum Orthodox kid has a grandmother with a cross. I remember once we went to Shavua Sefer. That's what you think. I went to Shavua Sefer. There was a book fair. And my young brother Avichai was lost in the crowd. And the grandmother held her cross. She prayed to Jesus. And then suddenly, poof, Avichai appeared. So I remember as a kid, I was like, wow. Anyway, so this is like when you're... No, I'm saying this, by the way, as a teenager, I was so embarrassed of my Catholic secret background. I was hide it. I also didn't like my American background, because as a teenager, I had a large period of my life where I was a jerk, so my wife thinks it's still going on. But like I used to speak English like this with the Israeli accent because I'm not American, I have nothing to do with my parents. I am tough Israeli, that's me. But it took me years after the military to try to polish my American accent. I don't know how this is going, but trying, maybe it can be understood. Anyway, all this is just background. This is way over, but all background for when I was a kid. I don't know if I was 9 or 10. I hear my mother, which I'm highly aware of her background, speaking to her Israeli friends, and they're speaking about anti-Semites. And my mom was like, yeah, they always persecuted us. In the Middle Ages, they were persecuting us, and these Spanish Inquisition and pogroms and crusades, they were always persecuting us. And it was confusing. So I asked my mom, but Mommy, your ancestors weren't persecuted. I mean, maybe it was even, the other. So my mom says to me, honey, I'm Jewish, and we were persecuted. Now, I'm becoming 50, it took me about till now to understand what she said. This is what Rambam understood. And this is a great window into what collectivism is and what belonging means. We think that when you change a collective, it's transformational, like in a moment of conversion. You belong to this club, and now you belong to that club. That transformation, it's so dramatic because you're changing your future. And it's true, you're changing the future, but the heart of the drama is not that when you convert, you change your future. When you convert, you change your past. That's the drama. It's the transformation of your past. So this is my definition of collectivism, and this is, I think, the meaning of Judaism in Jewish democracy. It's not a faith you believe in, it's not the law that you obey, it's a story that you belong to. This is belonging. The collective has a story. When you feel that you belong to the collective, so the story of the collective becomes your own personal story. This is what Rabbi Jonathan Sachs calls turning history into biography. What do we say in Leil HaSeder? Chayav Adam lir'ot et atzmo ki'ilu hu. So that is, the collective has a story. Belonging means that the story of the collective becomes my individual story. It's turning history into biography. So that is, I think, Pshat Megillat HaAtzmaut, which tells a grand story of the Jewish people and saying, you are a part of that story. It's not a faith you believe in. It's a story you belong to. That is the Yehudit part of Yehudit v'Demokratit. Now I want to ask, what does the Demokratit part mean? What is the Demokratit part? Well, when Israelis say Demokratit, what they mean is liberal democracy. They mean, and liberalism and democracy are two separate ideas. And both of them are different answers to different questions. Democracy is the answer to the question, what is the legitimate source of the power of government? What's the source of the power, the only legitimate source of the power of the government? That's a question that's the question that democracy is an answer to. Liberalism is an answer to a different question. Not what is the source of the power, but what are the limitations of the power? So what is the answer of democracy? What's the only legitimate source of the power of the government? The people, but not as a people, as the sum of the individuals. Every person has the same vote of someone else. So the individuals are the source of the power of the government. Liberalism is not about the source of the power, it's about the limits of the power. What are the limitations of power of government according to, Locke, Mill, classic liberal school of thoughts? What are the limitations on the power of the government? The individual rights. So you see, the individuals are also the source of the power, and their liberties, their rights are the limits of that power, which means the idea behind liberal democracy, behind both ideas, there's one idea hiding behind both, which is individualism. So and I want to go back and just see what we did here. I tried to unpack Jewish democracy, Jewish collectivism, democracy, individualism. So the tension between what I want to establish is that the internal tension of Israel, Jewish democracy, is not faith versus religion, is not reason versus faith. That's the wrong understanding of the tension in the Jewish democracy. It's not Torah ve'Madah, it's not faith and reason. Jewish, belonging to a collective, liberal democracy means the individual is the source of the power, the individual is a limitation of power. Jewish democracy is the tension of collectivism, individualism. Which takes us to take a closer look at Israel post-October 7th. It's interesting that the hybrid Israelis, which are liberal nationalists, what they be'etzem are, liberal means individuals have right, and nationalists, I belong to the collective. And it's an embodied internalization of collectivism and individualism. That's the yin-yang that explains the mainstream of Israel. And if we want to unpack this a little bit more, so I think we would probably all agree that mainstream Israelis are hyper-individualists. Hyper-individualists. I have my rights, stay out of my life. I'm not judgmental of chiyeh v'ten lichyot, which means live and let live. I'm not judgmental about what you do. We're all okay. And hyper-individualism, by the way, is not only that I have rights, also I have dreams and I'll pursue them and how will I pursue them? And I'll do it, as Frank Sinatra sings, my way. And Israelis are extremely ambitious in pursuing their dreams their own way. Try to tell an Israeli what to do. Ben Gurion said once that it's impossible to be the prime minister of Israel. Now this is back in the early 50s. Why is it impossible to be the prime minister of Israelis? Because to be the prime minister of Israel is to be the prime minister of 1 million prime ministers. And Zach's, what Moshe understood in the desert is these are people that are ungovernable. Every now and then a Jewish leader realizes these are ungovernable. You're all rabbis, so you know what I'm talking about. And so I have a dream. I'm going to create my startup. I'm going to pursue the dream. Here's Israeli rhetoric, ani lo ro'eh ba'einayim, which is impossible to translate. I don't see in my eyes, which means nothing will stop me. No one will tell me what to do. Very ambitious. I'm going to make that dream a reality in my own, and I'll do it my way, in my own. Oh, and I'm doing it in the free market when I'm competing with other Israelis, also very individualistic, also very ambitious, also doing it their way. In all this individualistic energy, what does it create for the country? It creates startup nation and abundance and creativity. And while I'm out there pursuing my own individual dreams, October 7th happens, and then we all witness something very profound. October 7th happened, and that ambitious individualist, where do we find him or her? Now they're in Khan Yunis for 120 days. Now, when you're in Khan Yunis, it's not about, oh, this is my dream. I'll implement it. No, a whole different emotional system is activated when you're in Khan Yunis. Or when you are one of the 300,000 Israelis that were outside of Israel before October 7th, and October 7th happened. And what did they do? I have a good friend, Daniel. He was in Goa in October 7th. Goa is where Israelis go to party. So you can imagine the profile of Israelis that were in Goa in October 7th is all the Israelis that didn't want to be in the Israel in the Chagim. So you would say, who needs all this heavy national stories that we belong to and celebrate them? I want to go to Goa to celebrate my own individual having fun agenda. And they were in, so you can imagine the profile of Israelis. And in Goa, as he told me, there were only two populations, Russians and Israelis. And the Russians are there because they don't want to be in Russia because Russia is in war. And Putin is recruiting wherever he can see. So they want to escape a country that's in war. They went to Goa and they met all these Israelis that were also in Goa. And then October 7th happens and the Russians were looking at the Israelis and they couldn't understand their behavior. What were they all doing? Every one of them, what were they all doing? Packing their bags, running to the airport, cutting in line. You know how Israelis cut in line? So, they were doing all that thing. And the Russians just couldn't understand. They're saying, we're here because we're escaping a country that's in war. And that's why we came to vacation. And you're escaping vacation in order to return to a country that's in war. But the truth is, not only did the Russians not understand the Israelis couldn't understand themselves. They couldn't understand we didn't, it's a moment where, my God, I have that in me. That collectivist instinct, I have that in me. That was a revelation. Because when you're 120 days in Khan Yunis, the emotional muscle, I'm thinking in Hebrew, I hope this works, that is, you practice when you're in an individualistic society, is of mimush atzmi, self-fulfillment or self-actualization. Which one would be the right words? Self-fulfillment? Self-actualization, taking my gift and turning into my reality. But the emotional muscle that is trained in a collective society, like when you're in Khan Yunis, is not of self-actualization, but of self-sacrifice. You see, individualism is a myth that our life is a story. And every moment in my life, I'm writing another chapter of my life's story. And that's how Western people tell their life story. Tell me your life story. I went to college, I opened a business, I got divorced. Every moment in life is another chapter in the story that is the story of your life. But collectivism is that my nation has a story. And what's my life? It's not even a chapter. It's not even a line. It's maybe a letter. Maybe it's a letter in a story that's bigger than myself. The story of the collective. So self-actualization is individualism. Self-sacrifice is collectivism. What we saw versus October 7th is something very profound and very interesting. How easy it is for Israelis to move between two modes. It's like Israelis have within them, not all of them, mainstream Israelis, two emotional systems. And on the day-to-day, the individualistic system is activated and you're like pursuing your dreams. Then October 7th, and a whole different emotional system is activated of collectivism. And is there a balance between individualism and collectivism? I think it's a yin and yang. There's moments where this is more dominant. There's moments where that is more dominant. But that is, I think, and discovering the yin yang of individualism and collectivism is very profound. I want to rely a minute on Jonathan Haidt, which you could tell has a large influence on these thoughts I'm presenting. Haidt has a take or an interpretation of Durkheim. Maybe the father of modern sociology. And Durkheim, and by the way, maybe some of you heard me talk about what does it mean to be a human being? And Durkheim, this is Haidt on Durkheim. And I checked this up in Durkheim. It sounds better when Heitz describes it, Durkheim. Human being is a homo duplex. Not homo sapiens, homo duplex. What is duplex? What is a duplex? It's like a building with 2 floors, right? So think about our internal world has 2 floors. Every floor is populated with different sets of emotions. Floor number 1, those are all the emotions that when we look at them, we recognize them. They're my individual emotions. My anxiety, my envy, my happiness, what I dread, my yetzarim, my chalomot, like all those are mine. In another floor, there's a whole different sets of emotions, which are emotions that are not, that you feel when you belong to something bigger than yourself. Like loyalty, patriotism, different sense of belonging. And Haidt argues the following: Western people have a hard time tapping into the second floor. Because when you're always indoctrinated to like your own dreams, your own rights, your own sensitivities, your own fears, you found that offensive. When you're all about your own, examining your own individual sensitivities and your own dreams, and you're pursuing your own, it's hard to escape yourself. So Haidt argues that's why Western people, they want to escape themselves. So, yesterday there was the Spain versus England. Did you see it? Yes. Oh, of course you did. Yes. So when you go to a sports game, you have a moment where you're escaping yourself. When you're part of like a crowd, as David Brooks says, sometimes politics becomes the answer to hyper-individualism. I want to escape myself, so I belong to a political tribe, and I share the ecstatic sense. We have a shared rage. We're all angry together. It's not my rage. It's our collective rage. So sometimes politics liberates you from yourself. By the way, when politics becomes a solution to psychological problems, politics itself becomes a problem. Or psychedelics. Anybody here experiment? Stam, I'm Israeli. We're not supposed to ask those questions. I'm sorry. Yes. And the questions you're allowed to ask a crowd in Israel are different. Can. Who here goes to therapy? Yeah, how many times? Yeah, okay, fine. What? How much do you make? Okay, let's go. So like the sense that you're like the Hindu metaphor that you are, when a drop makes it to the ocean, it's not a drop in the ocean. What is it? It's the ocean. So we have a need to feel like we're not a drop, that we're the ocean, that we're one with. Okay, so these are like very important human needs. So Haidt argues that Western society is very good at cultivating individualism, but not very good in creating access to different emotions where you belong to something bigger than yourself. But there's collectivist societies, like fundamentalist societies, communist societies, fascist societies. They're very good in you're the collective. But those kind of societies are not friendly to your own dreams, to your own rights, to your own individual aspirations. What Haidt argues in light of Durkheim is that humanity at its best is a challenge, is the ability to move freely from both floors. And what I'm trying to say is, if tapping into Haidt, Durkheim, that human beings themselves are hybrids. That we have a need to belong, and we have a need for self-actualization. We have to believe to forget about ourselves, and a need to implement ourselves. So we ourselves are hybrids. So what I'm trying to say is that the Israeli challenge, Israeliness at its best, Yehudit v'demokratit, collectivist individualism. It's hard to balance it. That yin-yang is not easy to play. It's very hard. But that tension is not an Israeli tension. That tension is the human tension. And trying to be Israelis at our best is the attempt to be just trying to live the fullness of humanity on both floors of our homo duplex. That was an attempt to unpack Yehudit v'Demokratit. To understand, I think, the largest group of Israelis, which are hybrid, liberal nationalists, collectivists, individualists. I want to take now this lecture to the third part. What's my time situation? Whoa. I'm speaking for like an hour and a half already. I feel like one of my Catholic cousins preaching. Should I open it now for Q&A, or should I? Okay, I'll try to do the third part quicker so we can open this up. So for some kind of, the way I'm always criticized that Micah always speaks about dialogue, but there's never much dialogue with him. So just so you know what to, yeah. I'm fine with dialogue as long as I'm doing all the talking. So. I want to do something that you're never supposed to do. I would like to make a prediction about the future. But not that this prediction has become a reality, but this prediction will help me make a point about, I think, a possible direction for Israel after this war. Many Israelis feel like this is a very dominant sentiment in Israel, that October 7th broke everything, which means the connection between past, present, and future has been broken down. Israel after this war is not a continuation of the Israel that existed before this war. It's a new beginning. It's Israelis are speaking about Israel 2.0. Ever hear that term? Israel 2.0. Or there are Israelis, or many soldiers fighting in this war call it Milchemet Ha'atzmaut Hashniya, the second war of independence. Now, why is it the second war of I try to make it like when I'm called to speak to soldiers, I try to leave what I do and to go. Actually, I'm not doing that as often as I used to. I also got tired. But in the beginning of the war, when I was called, I would come and speak to soldiers that are in the north, or in the south, or in Judea, in the West Bank, or like wherever. And I would ask them about this term, Milchemet Ha'atzmaut Hashniya, the second war of independence. And some Israelis didn't like that idea, that term, because in the Milchemet Ha'atzmaut Harishona, in the first war of independence, our chances for survival were not very high. When David Ben-Gurion, he knew that when he declares Israel's state, a large war will begin and Arab armies will invade Israel. And he was debating, should I do it, should I not do it? And he asked one of his generals, Yadin, what are our chances of winning? And Yadin famously said, what are our chances of winning? What did Yadin say? 50-50. So Ben-Gurion's like, okay, 50 we win, 50 we lose. What does it mean if we lose, by the way? Well, now we know how it looks like. 50 we win, 50 we lose. Ben-Gurion was like, okay, let's go for it. Creating Israel was a strategic gamble by Ben-Gurion, and we were lucky that we landed on the right 50. Are we in a 50-50 moment now? I don't think so. We're not in a 50-50 moment. It's not 50, well, we can't deny that there are real risks, but I would say it's more like 95-5, which is itself. If you want a plane that has 5% of crashing, I don't think you would have a fun flight, right? By the way, thank you for coming here. It's nice that you came to Israel at this time. I'm serious, by the way. But so it's wrong to say that we're in the second war of independence in the sense that we have that there's a 50% chance that we lose and everything is just, no, that's not. But other soldiers say, and this is that after the reason why after the War of Independence in 1949, when it was over, they came back home, they rolled up their sleeves, and they built Israel. And in that sense, Israelis feel like this is the second war of independence. Not because of the size of the risk, but because of the size of the opportunity. The opportunity to reinvent Israel. And with this in mind, what does it mean when we think? Because I personally am very pessimistic about this war and how it's going and where it's going. I'm very, very pessimistic. This doesn't look good. But I'm very optimistic about the promise of the ability of Israelis to renew Israel and reinvent Israel 2.0 on the other side. So and I think this captures the sense, there's polls that were done about Israelis, very optimistic about the long term, very pessimistic about the short term. By the way, there's a problem here because the only way to make it to the long term is to somehow survive the short term. Please don't ask me how we do that. But I want to speak about, so what I'm saying is the optimism I'll be sharing now is not about how do we solve the problem in the north or hostages in Gaza or Iran, like these, or this government or the problems that we have now. But on the long term, I want to offer a theory of why when Israel reinvents itself, there's good reasons to think that we'll invent itself when we understand we're divided into three, and the part of Israel that could lead Israel and heal Israel is mainstream Israel, the collectivist, individualist, the yin-yang of the largest group of Israelis, which that is their superpower, the individualism, collectivism. So this is and the reason why I think that Israel there is a promise of reinventing itself from the middle, from the center, from hybrid Israeliness, is not because of the power of hope. It's not that, let's believe that could be the future Israel, and because we believe it, because we hope, tatikva, as long as the hope will turn into reality, that's not the reason why I think this could become a new reality. Not because of the power of hope, but because of the power of an emotion that really drives societies and politics in a polarized world, which is the power of fear. And the first thing I want to say about, or think out loud about fear, it's very hard to develop fear regarding an issue that we don't have fresh memories. Where there's no memories, strong memory, there's no strong anxiety. I'll give you one example that proves this point. Rationally speaking, in Israel, we should be very afraid of earthquakes. Now, we're on the Shaver Asuri Afrikai, we're in the... and massive earthquakes happen once every century. And I think the last earthquake was more than 100 years ago. Which means we should be thinking a lot about earthquakes and being afraid of earthquakes, and that's rationally. But how many Israelis do you meet that are speaking about, I'm making, I'm not, how many Israelis do you ever speak about earthquakes? None. You know why? Because we don't have fresh because it's very hard. Oh, by the way, do you know when we will be seeing Israelis obsessed about earthquakes? The day after. Will all be earthquakes, and there'll be committees, and there'll be the big scandal that we didn't think about this, and how didn't we? I'll tell you why. That's human nature. It's hard to develop anxiety about an issue that doesn't have a strong memory attached to it. In Israeli politics, Israel has changed ever since the Second Intifada. And it was changed because of a very strong memory, the Second Intifada, that created a very strong anxiety, and it's anxiety directed at left-wing ideology and left-wing politics. In the 1990s, 1990s were complicated, but for the most part, we had very narrow left-wing governments. How narrow? Barak went to Camp David, but he didn't even have 61. How narrow? 1992, the elections of 1992. Here's something that's hard to believe. How many seats in the Knesset did Labor have in 92? 44. Meretz, to the left of Labor, how many mandates did they have? 12. Together they had 56. What do they have today together? Yeah. And then to pass a threshold of 60, so it's always complicated because it started with Shas, but then Shas left. It's complicated. But there was a moment when they had to pass where they were relying on the Communist Party and the Arab parties and the post-Zionist left. So very, very narrow and very, very left. And that was a pure left-wing government. What I mean by say pure, I mean no representatives of the center and the right. Pure, homogeneous, left. So that was the government of Oslo and later on of Barak, of Camp David. And in the Israeli collective memory, where did all this lead us to? The Second Intifada. Because in our memory, by the way, there's no nuance in memory. We had left and we had Intifada, and it's all linked. And 140 terrorist attacks and 1,100 Israelis murdered. And Israel went into trauma. And the trauma was, we're not doing this left-wing stuff anymore. We're not doing that anymore. The left does not have a realistic understanding of the neighborhood that we live in. And that led to Second Intifada and all that. Now that trauma that has a live memory feeding it is a trauma from the left. Now that anxiety pushed Israelis all the way to the right. And I want to come to this moment. In 2023, a pure right-wing government was formed. When I say pure, I mean no representatives of the left or the center-left or the center, only Yamin. Now that idea of a pure right-wing government has a name in Israel. How do Israelis call this kind of a government? Memshelet Yamin al-Maleh, which is hard to translate what it means. No. Now, Netanyahu always tried to avoid these kinds of governments. He always tried to have a center-left, centrist in his government, so it won't be al-Maleh. There won't be pure right-wing. Tzipi Livni, Ehud Barak, Hilu Kachlon, Yair Lapid, Benny Gantz. That's how Bibi liked his governments, not Yamin al-Maleh. But in right-wing circles, in the past 5 years, a fantasy was cultivated that one day we won't have a center-left. For the right, it's all left. There's no center. Ideologues always deny the existence of a center, by the way. On the left also. We need to create a government with no babysitters. No people from the center, center-left, that will block our ability to take our right-wing ideology and implement it and impose it on reality. One day, we'll have a Memshelet Yamin al-Maleh. One day, we'll have a strong majority that will enable us to create a government without representatives from the center-left. One day. So Memshelet Yamin al-Maleh used to be a fantasy. By the way, it was also an answer to a question. When you ask people on the right, you're in power since 1977. Not all the time, on and off, but for the most part, ever since 77, on and off, you're in power. So if you're in power for so many years, lama ze lo Gan Eden? Why aren't we in Gan Eden? And you know what the answer is? Here's one of the answers. There's a few answers, but a good one is because we never really were in power. Because we always have centrists and leftists in our governments that are blocking our ability to turn reality into our ideology, to look more like our vision for Israel. One day, Yamin al-Maleh, pure right-wing government. So that was it used to be a fantasy. Now, do you know what's the best way to ruin a fantasy? The best way to ruin a fantasy is to implement it. That's the best way to destroy a fantasy. That's why the greatest Zionists don't live in Israel. Because why ruin the fantasy? Why ruin the fantasy? So 2023, a Memshelet Yamin al-Maleh, a pure right-wing government was formed. And 2023 turns into the worst year in Israel's history. And now we're in this horrible war, and we don't really know what the way out is. And I want to imagine the following. Right now, we're in the past, right? Think about it, we're in the past now. We're in the past of the future. 10 years from now, we'll be looking back, and we're in the past now. Right now, we're in the past of the future, right? Like in 10 years, are you looking back at 2024? And this was the past. Right now, it's an event. Soon it will be a memory. By the way, what shapes history more, events or memories of events? So when this is not an event, when this is a memory, this moment will continue being a part of our life even when it's over by the power of the memory. Now, I think it's very simple prediction that as we're talking, what used to be a fantasy will turn into a trauma. A fantasy is about the future. The trauma is about how you experience the past. Yamin al-Maleh, pure right wing, used to be a fantasy. Now it's changed its status. From now on, it's a trauma. Here's my argument. I don't know how this ends. We're on the other side of this. When Israelis are reinventing Israel. We will be now pushed towards a future, we have now a new memory creating new anxiety. The anxiety from pure, far right-wing politics. This new anxiety, this new trauma, does not cancel the old anxiety and the old trauma. The trauma from the left, it doesn't cancel that trauma. It doesn't replace that trauma. It's added to that trauma. The good news is, now we have a new set of anxieties. Because we have a new memory, a new traumatic memory that feeds a new kind, a new brand of anxiety, which doesn't replace the old anxiety, it's added to it. And if this prediction is correct, so Israeli future will now be pushed, not by hope, but by fear, but just this time by two different fears. Fear from the left, that's from the 90s, fear from the far right, and this is going to be pushing us to where? So the term center, the term middle, these are uncharismatic terms. Because middle always seems parv. Middle always seems not here, not there. Middle always seems like, okay, you're a compromise. You're lukewarm. Middle, I'm between liberalism and nationalism. But that doesn't capture Israel. Mainstream Israeliness is not the middle between liberalism and nationalism. A better metaphor would be an Eastern metaphor of the whole. It's a holistic center, not center as middle. Holistic, yin-yang, liberalism, nationalism. Which, if I have... Okay, it's 10:12 now. We have 18 more minutes for this thing we're doing together this morning. What about dialogue? Ah! Oh, so how does this work? After lunch, there's a Q&A session? Okay, sababa. So you're fine with me just continue preaching like my cousins? Okay. Okay, I want to dig deeper into hybrid Israeliness. And now I want to share an idea that you'll have to help me translate this into English. I want to create a distinction between haskama, agreement, and mirchav hahaskama. Mirchav, no. There is a space of agreement. Space of agreement. Two Israelis in the space of agreement don't necessarily agree. Being in the space of agreement doesn't mean that both Israelis agree. Being in the space of agreement means that the gap between their positions is narrow enough so that they could bridge that gap if they talk to each other, listen to each other, and in the end compromise with each other. My argument is that all the Israelis that are hybrid don't agree, but they're in the space of agreement. The gap between their positions is they could bridge that gap, but it's not, because my assumption is that Israelis have the same values, potentially could agree on policies and actions if they have the same values. Like Israelis are national and liberal. Cannot have really any compromise, can't really agreement with Israelis that are only national and not liberal. That don't believe in human rights. Okay, they can't really agree with each other. Or Israelis who are not Zionists, not national, think that we are all like a part of cosmopolitan. Okay, so if you're not Zionist, you don't believe in this national project, we can't really agree. But Israelis that are liberal nationalists, yin-yang, collectivist, individualists, that they have the same values, not the same proportions, potentially they could reach agreements. But there is one more condition of creating mirchav haskama, the space of agreement. And that is that they choose pragmatism over idealism. Let me just explain this point. Pragmatism versus idealism is, how do you measure an action, a policy, something you do in the world? So one way we say, okay, let's see this action and measure it when we compare it to the idea that it's supposed to implement. And if it's close to the idea, it's good. If it's too far away, you feel that it's dirty, it's a compromise, that's not good. That's how you measure an action, by comparing it to the idea, to the ideal. A pragmatist asks a different question. A pragmatist doesn't ask how close is it to the idea, it asks a different question. What's the question a pragmatist asks? Does it move the needle? Does it have an impact on the world? Does it work? A pragmatist is a person that has a dilemma between two sets of actions. One is more pure, the other is more effective. He'll always choose the second. Being effective is more important than being pure. Israelis that are hybrid in their values and pragmatic in their actions are in the space of agreement, and potentially they don't agree, but they could agree. That's a space that could reinvent Israel on the other side. Now, this idea of hybrid in your values and pragmatic in your actions has a story. The best, I would say, now, some of you picked up on this. The idea of nationalism and liberalism, combining them and letting them balance and soften each other and become who we are. The origins of this idea, of this hybrid Israeliness, is out of all the founding fathers and mothers of Israel. This was Ze'ev Jabotinsky. Ze'ev Jabotinsky, which was an ardent nationalist, he was also the greatest liberal thinker of Zionism. Ze'ev Jabotinsky. And his disciple, which was Menachem Begin, people don't know this, he was the greatest. He was fighting with Ben Gurion about a few issues. For example, between 1949 and 1966, there was a mishtar tzva'i, a military regime controlling the lives of Israeli Arabs. Now, I don't think we should be so over-judgmental about the sins of the past. They had their own narratives. But Menachem Begin was against it. Against a military regime on Israeli Arabs, he was against it. Ben Gurion was for it. Ben Gurion was for us delaying the conversation about constitution. Begin said we need a constitution because we're liberal and we need to create constraints on the power of government. Menachem Begin, that we all know as a nationalistic right-winger, he was also the greatest. He was a fighter for rights and liberalism. This was the combination of the revisionists. Liberalism and nationalism. By the way, not Labour Party. Labour Party was not hybrid liberal nationalists. They were a different hybrid. Socialist nationalists, which has a different energy to it. Because if nationalism is collectivism and liberalism is individualism, there's a yin-yang of collectivism, individualism, and the hybrid of nationalism, liberalism. But what is nationalism, collectivism? Nationalism, socialism. Nationalism is collectivism. Socialism is collectivism. So you have a real balance between collectivism. And by the way, it wasn't fun here in the 50s. The collective was much more important back then than the rights and prosperity of individuals. This was Begin, that yin-yang of nationalism. So when I say that most Israelis are hybrids, that is the victory of Jabotinsky and Begin in the battle of Israeli ideas. But Begin and Jabotinsky were not pragmatic. And the best way to see how idealism sometimes can be a serious problem is when Israel was offered by the UN, by the UNSCOP committee in the UN, a state on 55% of 55% of Eretz Israel, of the land of Israel. And it offered the Arabs a state on the rest. And Jerusalem International. This was called the Partition Plan. And the UN voted for it in 29th of November. What did Begin say? No. Why? Because he took this plan and he compared it to the ideal, and the ideal is the completeness of the land. Shlemut haaretz. And it was too far away. He measured the policy with the idea. He compared it to the idea. It was too far away, and he felt it's dirty, it's a compromise. He couldn't accept it. What did Ben Gurion say? He says it's not perfect, it's not right, it's far from the idea. Let's take it anyway. Because it moves the needle and it changes Jewish history. It has true impact on the future of Jews. Ben Gurion saying yes is pragmatism. Begin saying no is idealism. By the way, these two sentiments clash throughout history. In the 1950s, Western Germany offered Israel, how do you say that? Pitzuim? Reparations. Millions of Deutschmarks. And we were a third world country that had to accept waves of immigration for people from poor it was impossible here. And we needed that money. And what did Begin say? We have ideals. It contaminates our ideals. It's turning your back on your national, on your history, on the victims, on your honor. And Ben Gurion said, it's true, if we take the money, we'll turn our backs on our honor, on our history, on our tradition, we'll just take the money anyway. That was why? Because I'm not measuring an action by how pure it is, but how effective it is. The tradition of labor in Israel, of Mapai, is a tradition of pragmatism. And of the revisionist of Begin, Jabotinsky, of puritanism, idealism. My argument is that the space of Mechava Askama, the space of agreement is created by two foundations. There is a value foundation that we're all that of national liberals, and a practical approach of pragmatism over idealism. The pragmatism is what we inherited from Ben Gurion. The national liberalism is what we inherited from Begin. The new invisible consensus of Israel is where two Zionist traditions meet. The values of the revision of Begin and the approach of Ben Gurion of pragmatism, they meet, and this is where most Israelis are. Hybrid in their values, pragmatic in their actions. Not all Israelis. We have purists. That's okay. The problem with purists, you can't compromise with them. It's okay, but that's why they're outside of the space of potential agreements. We have homogeneous Israelis and their values. That's okay. But all Israelis that are hybrid in their values and pragmatic in their actions are the Israelis that in their world, both schools of Zionism have made peace. The values of the right and the attitude of the left, these are just words that make it easier to think about it, meet to create mechava askama, the space of potential agreement, which takes me back to the first part of this lecture. Israel is suffering from the problems of Western civilization, where you're trapped in a mythology that your society is divided into two. The other side is a threat to the future of society, and therefore I can't compromise with that other side. I can only defeat the other side. The other side feels the same way, so while we're trying to save Israel from each other, we're ruining Israel we're ruining the country. Does Israel have a chance to escape that pathology? I think so. It has a chance to move from the politics of defeating each other to the politics of compromise. It has the chance because Israel is not divided into two, it's divided into three. The largest group of Israelis are hybrid in their values, they're pragmatic in their actions, they're inheritors of two schools of thought, of the revisionists, their values, and the pragmatism of Ben Gurion and Mapai. This seems way too good to be true. But the power that might be able to push Israel to this new consensus is not the power of positive thinking. It's the power of negative thinking. It's the power, not the power of hope, the power of fear. In 2024 or 2023, a new fear was born that balances the old fear. The fear from the right, balancing a fear from the left, pushing us to a new space. My work is I just don't want that new space to be seen as the middle, because the middle is a place that you're pushed to. The holistic vision for Israel, we might also feel drawn to, not only pushed to, drawn to. So I think fear from the right plus fear from the left, fear plus fear equals hope. That's the math that I tried to establish. That was my spiel. Thank you very much.